Thanks for joining me in the Church of the Good Shepherd as we dive into our oneness in God, especially in our diversity. Indeed, we welcome newcomers and dare I say old comers alike. So thanks for connecting. Be sure to subscribe and follow. We love connecting with people wherever they're at, whatever your ideas about faith, ideas about God. If you're doubting, I think that is just fine. We all have our doubts. We're all learning. So thanks for connecting. And today, let's start off by just taking a few moments to breathe, to connect with our inner self. The expansive awareness within, perhaps closing our eyes to connect with that sky-like consciousness. Remembering the most fundamental thing, the thing that no one can argue with you about, that you are. Not that you are this or they are that, but you are. In our reading today, we reflected on how Christ, God incarnate, at least according to many of us, I believe that, uplifted this idea of oneness, just as he himself was one with God. Christ emphasized that our relationship with each other, which with divinity, should emulate his own in complete unity, he prays. And I think it's interesting, this prayer of unification, because I think, when we start talking about unity, we often twist it the wrong way, the opposite way from what I think Christ tries to use it as. We use it to dominate, to control. We have some stark examples in the Nazis and others in our history. So I do think there is a wrong way to use this idea of unity. What do you mean by unity? But thankfully, we have enough teachings from Christ to know what he meant. It's not always how Christians use Christ's teachings, but Christ seemed to mean that we should accept others in diversity, lean into our compassionate awareness, our love and our wisdom from God, and embody it, doing acts of love and wisdom, because if that's what's in our hearts and our minds, we will naturally do them. And he ultimately defines following him as listening to what he has to say. He repeats that often. Don't call me Lord. Why say Lord? And not do what I told you to do. And I think it's something to hold onto if we're a follower of Christ. Now, there are many other traditions, funny enough, that have similar ideas about unity, similar ideas about compassion, especially when we look at the scripture. It's not always in our community. We don't always uplift the loving social justice compassion as we should, of course. It can be really hard, I think, for many of us, me included, to follow the Lord in a way that allows us to say, okay, I'm doing the social justice, I'm compassionately living, I'm following Christ in all the ways I should. But in our scripture, I think we tend to have prime examples throughout the world's traditions that we should turn to the unity of compassionate awareness in our diversity, in our openness. Christ is an excellent example of this because he so obviously embraced the other, the Samaritans. He embraced those who weren't Jewish, who were following him, who are Jewish. He embraced soldiers. He embraced thieves. And indeed, he said his message was for the entire world. But he didn't always, make the person he was encouraging, that he was holding, worship at his feet. He often reconnected them with the idea of divinity, reconnected them with the idea that maybe divinity is in other people, maybe they're in the presence of God, but ultimately tried to reconnect them with their selves, with their deep sourcedness in God. So this idea of oneness can be used in a lot of different ways. But we see in Buddhism and Hinduism, I think some similarities with Christ and other traditions as well, that turning towards compassionate awareness, what a Christian may call the compassionate light of God within, helps us to be better aware and better embody the unity we have in our diversity. So taking that time to pray, to meditate, to remind ourselves in any given moment, to reconnect with being, the great I am, what Jehovah calls himself, that sense of awareness that we can't lose. You have it right now. No matter how strange things become around you, no matter how hard it is to believe in something else, some of us even question our reality. We're always in the seat of awareness, even in dreams. You could say a dream is very much transient. Our earth is transient, our lives, every situation we're in is transient. But dreams kind of like a prime example of that. It happens for a little time, you have another one. And we're aware in those moments. Everything we see, you could say, is imaginary, but we're aware. And so taking that time in any moment to connect with what you know, which is that you're alive, you are conscious. And just that is often a practice uplifted to reconnect us with our intrinsic compassion, our sourcedness from divinity. We don't have to go find God. We don't have to, listen to a special teacher or sage or priest or rabbi to have a deep, fundamental, impossible to lose connection with divinity. But often we get so caught up in the distraction of our kind of false definition of ourselves. We get so caught up in our disconnection with others, in the strangeness of others, that judgment we cast onto others, that we lose the thread. We cover it up, so to speak. We just ignore it. It's just so obvious. We ignore it. That connection with God's compassionate love and wisdom, whatever we call God. And so I think those practices, what Christ asks us to do, letting go of our anger, our hate, letting go of hurtful motivations, hurtful mindsets, taking the time to pray, to meditate, to emulate Christ a little bit, maybe sometimes, escaping the crowds if that's our situation. Not many of us have that situation nowadays. Taking the time for our spiritual wellness, in whatever form that may take, so that we're clearing away our debris and reconnecting with divinity. Now, Swedenborg believed, our favorite 18th century mystic, that God is the source of all goodness and is indeed embodied in diversity because God is infinite, infinitely divine. He believed everything helpful is from divinity. And in the next life, in the underlying spiritual realm that we're connected to today, he believed, that diversity, that cultural, spiritual diversity continues on in heaven. at least the healthy aspects of our various approaches to spirituality and culture. And that to eternity, angels, which are us in heaven, according to Swedenborg, are perfected more and more. We continue to grow because no matter how much we learn, no matter how wonderful an embodiment of loving, compassionate, no matter how much an angel shines with that light of the spiritual sun that she receives, there's room to grow. There's room to grow. Whatever they are, however good we are, there's room to grow, and there's a greater awareness of our connection with divinity to be had, an embodiment of that connection. And the more that diversity fills heaven, the more people and aliens, according to Swedenborg, fill heaven, the more perfection there is. Now, whether or not you believe Swedenborg about that, I think there's something so obvious in that message, so practical, that we have to have a really vested interest in hating other people to entirely ignore. You know, we may have criticisms of others, at least other people's embodiments as we see them. Obviously, I mentioned Nazis earlier. It didn't sound like I was very approving of their actions. So there's criticisms. There's sometimes harsh in reaction that we must have, holding people accountable. But I think often we lean into the punishment aspect. We lean into the divisiveness. And we don't allow room for rehabilitation. We don't allow room for growth. And often it's not someone as obvious as Hitler that we're hating on. It's anyone. And as we reconnect with our meditative connection with awareness, with God, in the light and peace of consciousness, love, and wisdom that we receive from divinity, the more we can realize where we're casting this kind of hateful light. It could just be how we image other people. I think that's one thing we often overlook, is that sometimes when we have an image of someone in our head, if you notice, it's not the best image. Now, sometimes you notice beautiful things about them, wonderful things about them, but when you just have that cursory past sometimes, it could be someone in our family, someone in our past. It's just this kind of cartoonish, negative thing. And so realizing that divisive thinking, realizing that it's going on and letting go of it goes a long way. Indeed, in psychotherapy and in counseling, we learn that there's something like this that is often used as a tool for our mental well-being. And that's watching ourselves as if we're a third party. Watching our minds, watching our actions. And indeed, in a way, I think you kind of realize there is a little distance there. We identified so much the body and the mind that when we use that psychotherapeutic practice of watching our minds, watching our behavior, we start to realize, that awareness, that light of awareness that shines into my mind, that shines into the world, is more me than these aspects. It's the more fundamental aspects of me. Now, as we said, we're talking about unity here, so it would be strange if I left it at, we're not those things. But I think as we come to reconnect with our deeper awareness, we start to realize that that's fundamental to everything. And so, in a way, we are a part of everything. And in actuality, perhaps, we are one with all. Now, Christ clearly was praying for something specific. He didn't make it sound like we were quite in the unity he was speaking of. And as we learn from Christ over and over again, remembering ourselves, remembering the oneness, helps bring us more in alignment with the reality of things. Helps us to become more aware of our spirit, of the Spirit. Allows us the compassion to have patience with ourselves, patience with other people. It's not just other people we cast in negative lights, we do it to ourselves all the time. And so sometimes that distance is needed from our judgmental, our hurtful, our hateful, our bigoted, our anxious, our fearful practices, habits. Sometimes some distance is needed because, if we're going to sit with every single thing, and sometimes we do need to sit with what's happening, just watching, not following it, not obsessing. It would take forever, I think, to reconnect with that sense of peace. And that's why I think that prayerful practice, that meditative practice, is so empowering because it helps us take a step back from our minds and realize that we are greater in our diversity and unified in light of God. Now let's take a moment to do just that. Taking a few deep breaths. Identifying more with the light of awareness. The open sky-like nature of fundamental consciousness. Noting the thoughts that come up. Not necessarily judging them, but noting if we do. Just watching what happens. I think part of the reason meditative prayer is so often uplifted in Scripture, same with chanting, same with Scripture reading, is that in that mode, in that contemplative mode, we kind of let go of our false identity with our histories, our distorted picture of ourselves, the picture other people seem to have of us, or at least we think they might. We let go of it to reconnect with the peaceful intrinsic awareness within, perhaps getting wisdom from the Lord in those moments, getting insight. Perhaps finding a new compassionate light in those moments. As we let go of the changeful, we watch it, but we're not identifying as much with it. We find the unchanging, that core connection with divinity, the light of awareness. Perhaps that's why Christ shone like the sun in his transfiguration. And as we lean into this practice, it doesn't have to be a meditation, it just could be in the middle of whatever you're doing. We find that stability in the infinite, eternal, unchanging God. In a changing world, that's often what we yearn for. When we seek that consoling habit, it's good to remind ourselves what we're yearning for is source. It's true food, true drink, as Christ shares, everlasting. And as we find it, we'll never thirst again. As we find Christ, known by many names, the Messiah, known by many guises in people's lives. And we find that within, that divine teacher that's always within. We'll find peace in the Prince of Peace. We'll find love in that Queen of Love within. Wisdom in her as well. And get to know a God beyond description often. Empowering our own diverse light, our own diverse expression of Him. Finding that we see the beauty of the diversity around us as an extension of that light, as part of ourselves. Not in an over-attached way, but rooted in our knowingness and awareness.
Jesus from Galilee. They saw where he was placed after the tree. So they returned, prepared spices and perfumes. And on the third day of the week at dawn, they came to the tomb. Bringing the spices they had prepared, they found the stone rolled away. While they stood, two angels appeared. The woman heard them say, "Why do you seek the living one among the dead? Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, he is risen, just as he said. Why do you seek the living one among the dead?" Remembered the words that Jesus said before his seeming doom. He said that he would suffer death, but on the third day rise again. So they ran and told the disciples, this is what they said. They said, "Why do you seek the living one among the dead? Why do you seek the living one among the dead? Here he is risen, just as he said. Why do you seek the living one among the dead?" are searching like so many wise men. You give anything at all to know the truth. But if you'll stop and listen to what the angel says, you'll find that he is speaking right to you and saying, why do you seek the living one among the dead? Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, he is risen just as he said. Why do you seek the living one among the dead?